forget to do introductions. Great. So my name is Tara Cornelisse, and I am the lead zoologist at NatureServe. And I will tell you all a little bit more about what NatureServe is in a moment. But my background, I have my Ph.D. in environmental studies from UC Santa Cruz, where I studied endangered tiger beetle down in Santa Cruz County. And I've mostly been working on insects and conservation most of my career. I've worked as a professor, but also as a scientist at nonprofits, which I currently am now as well. So yeah, got any tiger beetle questions at the end too? Feel free to ask. All right. So I'm here to talk to you today about insect declines, evidence for that, the causes, and hopefully some solutions. Sorry, I'm just moving the little video box. Okay. Great. So I mentioned that I work at NatureServe, and some of you may have heard of NatureServe, some of you may not. It's not super well known, but it kind of was born as the data hub out of the Nature Conservancy, but it's currently its own national nonprofit. And the mission is to leverage science, data, and technology to guide biodiversity conservation and stewardship. And the cool thing about NatureServe is that we're composed of 60 network partners throughout the United States and Canada. And I will do a little slide switch so you can kind of see what those networks are. They're in alphabetical order here. So the one in California is the California Natural Diversity Database. It's probably one you're most familiar with. But all the other states and provinces of Canada have their own sort of version of that. So oftentimes they're called natural heritage programs or biodiversity database programs. And they're housed in either state agencies or universities. So they kind of vary a little bit in that respect. But basically, NatureServe is kind of the central hub of all of those network programs. And those network programs are composed of people that are on the ground collecting data for species and ecosystems. So keeping track of what they've got in their own states and jurisdictions. And so as you can see, there's some big numbers here. We've got, over 100,000 species that we keep track of, and over 7,000 ecosystem types that are classified within the network. And then so kind of what I just said is sort of what happens on the left-hand side of this slide here. So we've got like the in-field observations, the data sources that are coming from the network programs, the people on the ground, and then we do an exchange with the network programs, and we sort of have this central data hub where then we're able to use that information and create products that are then used for conservation. And here on the right-hand side are some of those products. And I'll be talking mostly today with you about the conservation status assessments, so that third one down on the right-hand side. But we have several other products that come out of the data that we model and analyze and synthesize for conservation. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about later about how those are then used to make conservation decisions at the state level. And we also work with federal agencies as well, such as sensitive species on BLM land and Forest Service land, for example. So I'm here to talk to you about insects, and I am basically the resident invertebrate zoologist at NatureServe, and so I spend a lot of time assessing insects. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about conservation status assessments soon, but basically what I'm trying to figure out is how each species of insect that we track, how it's doing. Is it secure? Is it imperiled? Is it vulnerable? That kind of thing. And so usually when I talk about the work in insects, I like to kind of start with a sort of more general overview of what insects are, because some people know a lot about insects and a lot of people know very little about insects. And so basically what I'm showing you here is a pie chart of animals, and you can see kind of in the center of that pie chart, there's it's outlined where the arthropods are, and that is over 75% of the animals. And the arthropods include insects, which you can see is the subset of that, which is a class that includes about 75% of all animals. And so they pretty much make up most of the known animal species that we have on this planet. And so as a result, they're pretty important. And there's important for a lot of other reasons too, which I'll get to. But just for the fact that there's so many of them, and they make up such a high amount of biodiversity on this planet is pretty cool. So what are insects? Insects are defined by a few things. One of those things is that they always have three body parts. So on the right-hand picture, you can kind of see of this generic cartoon insect. There's always a head, a thorax, which the legs are attached to, and an abdomen. And insects are also unique in that they have 3 pair of legs, so 6 legs. If they have more, if you see something that has more than that, it's not an insect. They also have generally a pair of antennae, as well as a pair of, or 2 of wings. And wings can be modified in kind of unique ways. So in the lady beetle picture here on the left-hand side, beetles, like the ladybug, they have the hardened wings, that hardened outside shell. So that's kind of a modification of the wings. And then in flies, like this crane fly here on the bottom left, they have something called halteres, and those are actually that second pair of wings that have been modified, and they basically become these like balancing organs. So that's one way flies are so good at flying. So if you ever try to catch a fly, crane flies are not so hard actually, so it's kind of a bad example, but if you ever try to catch a housefly, you know it's not easy to do because they can get away from you pretty quickly. Some other defining features of insects is that they have 2 kinds of development, and this really helps us to classify insects. The one you're probably most familiar with is the one on the left, the complete metamorphosis. That's the one you tend to learn about often as a school kid, where hopefully you've experienced maybe raising a moth or a butterfly. So you get to kind of see that egg turn into a caterpillar that then grows and grows, that then turns into a cocoon or a chrysalis, and then becomes the adult that looks drastically different than that larva stage or the caterpillar stage. On the other hand, there's lots of groups of insects, including grasshoppers, as you can see here, that have something called incomplete metamorphosis, which is actually more similar to what we as mammals undergo. So it hatches out of the egg and looks more like a mini adult. And then that mini adult grows until it becomes the sexually mature adult. And I'd like to kind of talk about these 2 different ways that insects can develop, because it's one of the reasons that they have become so successful evolutionarily. There's so many of those species, as I just said, and the reason for that is because they have these really unique life histories and these ways where they can, you know, take advantage of the environment, if you will. And so they're pretty cool that way. They're also important because of types of ecosystem functions they play. So this might be getting closer to kind of what you might know more about insects and what they do. And they perform many ecosystem functions, and one of which is nutrient cycling. So dung beetles are kind of famous for this. You know, they sort of directly take the dung and put it back into the earth. And so their nutrient cycling is very obvious. Termites are also really important for this. Termites decompose rotting wood. Another ecosystem function that is probably most familiar to folks is pollination. So here's a picture of a syrphid fly with its head buried in a flower, and you can kind of see pollen all over it. And pollination is an extremely important one, and we'll talk more about pollination throughout this talk. Seed dispersal is another one that I think some folks know, especially plant folks like yourselves. You probably are a little bit aware of this, but a lot of people don't think about insects as seed dispersers, and ants are pretty important for this as well. Biological control is another one that's very important. So there's a lot of insects that are predators or parasites on other insects. And so they're really important, particularly in like agricultural settings where they can kind of control what, you know, some people consider pest species. And then finally, another reason insects are so important for ecosystem functions is the aquatic insects like this dragonfly nymph, as well as mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies are really important for what we call indicator species. And so if there's a healthy populations of those groups of insects, then we're able to kind of tell that that body of water is, you know, it's generally healthy. There's like maybe less pollution or less turbidity in that. And so it helps not only ecosystems with purified water, but also for us to know, you know, how that freshwater ecosystem is doing. Clearly they're very important. There's a lot of them. They do a lot of cool things and they're really important. But folks have actually tried to estimate how much those services that insects provide are worth. And there's been several studies on this, but this one I like because it looks just at insects, not other animals, and it's just in the United States, so not worldwide. And it also was 20 years ago, I want to point out, so it's probably, more now. But in 2006, the estimate was that insects provided $67 billion per year in the US alone of services. So pretty unique. So they're pretty important for a variety of reasons. Including economically. So what's happening now? So unfortunately, I love talking about insects, but unfortunately I'm here to kind of talk a little bit about insect decline, which is something that has become a more and more recognized phenomenon. And really just in the last 10-ish years. And so this paper came out in 2014 about the defaunation in the Anthropocene. So basically what that means is just like the loss of animal species in today's world with humans dominating. And it particularly was alarming because it really showed that over 67% of invertebrate populations over the past 40 years during that time had shown a 45% decline in mean abundance. And so many of these papers, and some that I'll be talking about today, have different metrics. And so this one looked at the mean abundance, so literally just how many there are. And so a 45% decline in nearly 70% of the species that they looked at. And this was worldwide. And this graph is one of the major graphs from that paper. And what it's showing you is whether those groups of species are stable, increasing in the green, or decreasing in the red. And so you can see that the beetles and then the ants, bees, and wasps, which is the second one there, they have about 50% of the species that were looked at are declining in abundance. And the grasshoppers, all of those that they looked at actually were declining. Whereas the butterflies are a little bit more around 25%, and then the dragonflies a little bit less. But still, all of that is pretty alarming. And so this was in 2014, as I mentioned. And so that kind of really kicked off like a lot of investigation into this to really look and see, okay, what's going on? Is it really happening? Are my data showing that kind of thing in the scientific community, at least? And one paper that really, I think, became even more clear that this was alarming was one that came out of Germany. And the reason that it was a little bit more scary is because it looked at insects in protected areas. So not urban areas or areas that maybe were converted heavily to agriculture, but in areas that were generally the same over time. And what they found, they had a really robust data set where they collected insects every year or even more frequently than that. And what they found was that over this 30-year period, that 75%, there was a 75% decline in insect biomass. And so what they did was all the insects they collected, they weighed them. So they didn't kind of go through them and count each species. They actually just weighed the amount of insects that they collected. And so the weight of that, the biomass, declined by 75% over those 30 years. So that was really shocking, especially because a lot of those insects that they catch and the type of traps they use are the ones sort of that are just, flying above our heads, that get splatted on our windshield, that get eaten a lot by bats and birds and whatnot. So pretty scary. And shortly after, that's where the New York Times article came out that I really think got the general public kind of more aware of this. It was a really kind of great article that covered a lot of really important information, but it really also helped to kick off like a big debate in the scientific community and cause people to really kind of kick up and start studying this even more. And since then, the consensus has started to appear, and unfortunately, there's been several studies, and this is just kind of a smattering of those. And all of them do find a general decline, and the average tends to be about 2% annually in temperate biomes. So, and that's of terrestrial insects. So the pattern that keeps coming out sort of paper after paper is this average of decline. 2% of terrestrial insect abundance is declining in temperate biomes. So we don't know enough in tropical areas to say that that's the case, and we don't quite know enough about aquatic insects to say that that's the case. And so those kind of studies need to be ongoing. But in temperate areas, we're really seeing this consistent pattern. And 2% annually might not sound like a lot, but if you're kind of mathematically inclined, you might think, well, that is actually quite a bit. And Dave Wagner has mapped this or graphed this actually over 40 years. And if you start out with 10,000 insects and you have just a 1% decline, you're going to end up with slightly less than 7,000 insects in 40 years. But if you have this 2% decline, you actually end up with less than half of them in just 40 years. So that, that's, some folks are saying, well, you think about it, if you're an entomologist and you're just starting to study insects now, by the end of your career, you could see a substantial decline. And a lot of folks who are kind of, including myself, kind of in the mid-career, are really noticing those things. So as time went on, the paper started showing these different results, but there was that clear signal. And one of the other clear signals that was coming out is that pollinators, in particular of the insects, seem to be taking more of a hit. They seem to be worse off. And here's a graph from a study that looked at bee records. So this is showing you just the number of records of two different bee families. So the top one is the Megachilidae, which are the leafcutter bees, and the bottom are the Apidae, which include bumblebees and digger bees and some others as well. And over the last about 50 years, you could see that the number of records, just sort of that you can find out there in data repositories, has fluctuated a little bit. But within the last about 30, 40 years, there's been this, kind of more steep decline just in the number of records. And in the paper, they kind of also showed that the number of surveys hasn't gone down, and in fact, in some cases has gone up. So you'd expect the number of records to go up if those species were in the same numbers. So pretty alarming to see that these two really important bee families have so few records compared to what they had 50 years ago. Other studies have really been looking at butterflies. This one came out of the Midwest, and they looked at the butterflies counted through these structured surveys. And from 1995 till about 2019, they found this decline in the number of butterflies. And it, in fact, was about 2% per year. So again, kind of hitting on that consensus that a lot of these papers are coming to. So knowing all this, knowing, that there's insect declines happening, that pollinators particularly are taking the hit, and that we have these really great data at NatureServe, where we have these conservation statuses of all these species, we thought, like, well, we could really add to this body of knowledge by looking at the status of pollinators in a general level. So we had a paper come out earlier this year in PNAS called The Elevated Extinction Risk of Over 1/5 of Native North American Pollinators. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the results that we found now. And due to the NatureServe network, as I just described earlier, we had access to these data and these ranks and this knowledge from the states. So we were able to ask in our paper, what is the overall conservation status of pollinators in the US and Canada? What groups are most at risk? So we looked at several different groups, which I'll tell you in a minute. Where do these at-risk species occur? So we were interested in the geography of it. And then what and where are the major stressors or threats of these at-risk species? So this probably goes without saying to you all, but we also had to define what a pollinator was. Probably you could do that on your own if I asked you to, but what we said is that a pollinator are animals that transfer pollen while feeding on nectar or pollen. And so as a result of feeding on the plant, they then transfer pollen to another plant to aid in that plant's fertilization. And usually those are bees are the most popular, famous ones, butterflies, as well as some vertebrates like birds and bats. And we did include those in our study, but I'm just going to stick to the insects for tonight. Also, probably, why do they matter? You probably all are pretty familiar with this, but they pollinate over 80% of flowering plants, over a third of global food production, particularly fruits and vegetables that are very nutritious. And also, as I just kind of got over saying, they are declining kind of seemingly at a potentially disproportionate rate compared to other insects. So we were really interested in this question. And we looked at the data that we had and how we were able to analyze these questions that we had. And so we decided to include these groups of pollinators that we thought that we could accurately give an assessment of. And so we included several bee groups. We included the family Apidae, which includes the bumblebees, the carpenter bees, digger bees, squash bees. We included the family Megachilidae, which are the leaf cutters, and mason bees. We included some sweat bee families, or some sweat bee genera as well, not all of them, but some. We included all the butterflies that occur in the United States and Canada. We included some macro moths. So moths are sometimes tricky to figure out who pollinates and who doesn't. Some moths don't actually feed as adults, and so we included only the ones that we were certain were potential pollinators because they fed as adults. We also included some flower flies or syrphids or hoverflies as we know them more often in the United States. And flower flies are really important pollinators, and so an interesting group to include. And then a couple families and genera of those families of beetles that we know were important pollinators. So those were the groups that we included. And what did we do? Well, basically, it was nearly 1,600 species, so about 1,600 species we were able to include. And for all of those species over the last 10 years, particularly over the last 3 years, we conducted conservation status assessments. And at NatureServe, this is something that we do a lot. And you may not have heard of NatureServe conservation status assessments, but you probably have come across them without even knowing it. They're used a lot on government websites. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up a species and you see that it has a conservation status, it's likely to be NatureServe's conservation status. They're also on iNaturalist if you use those as well. So you'll see them kind of all over, they pop up. But basically they are a standardized scientific and empirical way for us to assign a classification of conservation for a species. And we have created a rank calculator that's been around for about 30 years that has been kind of evolved over time with conservation theory and troubleshooting, and it's pretty cool tool and method that not only we use, but our network programs in the States use as well. So how do we actually do conservation status assessments? Well, basically, we need to know a lot about a species to be able to give it a status assessment. And you can imagine that's not always the case, especially for insects. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But basically, to figure out the rank of a species, whether it's secure or vulnerable or imperiled, we have to kind of know some things about it, particularly its range. So where does it occur and what's the extent of that occurrence? How many of the occurrences there are? Population numbers, trends, if we're able to get trends, if the species is increasing or decreasing or staying the same over the long term or over the last 10 years, that's the short term. And we're also interested in looking at threats. So what threats are they, where do they occur, and how severe they are to the populations of those species. And to answer all these questions, we have to utilize lots of information that's out there. So lots of databases. Some of you, if you work with data, you might be familiar with these, but iNaturalist is probably the one most people are familiar with. But we have our network again, who has data. And then there's some great globally recognized online data systems as well to get all the records for species. We also rely on published papers. So there's been some great papers published recently, one here on the left that has examined the ranges of over 3,000 bee species in the United States, which is extremely helpful for ranking, as well as species that a paper that looked at species in the West, butterflies in particular, and how they are increasing or decreasing, and then putting that in the context of threats of climate change and development. So there's lots of really great science that's coming out that we're able to use to create these ranks. And then what do they look like? Well, basically, once it goes through the rank calculator, it gets assigned one of these ranks or calculated one of these ranks. And it's on a G scale, and G stands for global, because what we do mostly is rank the entire range of the species, which we call the global range, whereas a state will rank the state rank. So that's called an S rank. So our scale goes from 1 through 5, and 5 being the most secure. In the pollinator paper that we just did, G4, which is apparently secure, and G5 were grouped together as secure. And then the other three, GH through G3, were considered to be species at risk of extinction. G1 being the most imperiled, G3 being vulnerable. And then GH is this category of possibly extinct. And this is one that hasn't been seen in decades, despite folks looking for it. And so we have it not as extinct because there's a potential it could still be out there, but there's been a few decades where it hasn't been documented, unfortunately. And then of course we also have below the arrow is the GU, and those are the species that are data deficient or ones that do not have enough information to actually assign it a rank. Okay, so again, we ranked nearly 1,600 pollinator species, and what we found was that on average, 22.6 of them were in those at-risk categories. And we kind of looked at this average because, as you can see, we had 9% of them were data deficient or GU. And you can imagine that a lot of those species in that category, they're unrankable because there's just not that much known about them. And as a result, they're likely species that probably are pretty rare. There's just not that much data out there about them. We can't be certain if it's because there haven't been surveys or not. And so it kind of just becomes this unrankable one. But likely there is something of conservation concern going on there. So if we did include all of those in the at-risk category, we'd be closer to 30% of the pollinators that we looked at being at risk. So that's where that 29.6 comes into play. On the other hand, if we kind of considered them all secure, that would be the lower end. So likely the real number is closer to 30%, somewhere in the middle there. I also wanted to point out the large percentage that are this light blue color, the G4, and those are what we consider apparently secure. And those are important for conservation because even though they kind of are in that secure category, there's something going on with them, whether it be, they have not very many populations. Maybe there's a threat that's impacting them, or potentially their populations declined over time in the long term. So there's something going on. So they're not considered at risk of extinction right now, but they're kind of like the to watch species. That's kind of how I see those. So there is a pretty big chunk of those, about 27%. So taking those data and looking at each of those groups of insects that we examined, you can see here's the same categories from critically imperiled to secure in the colors, and then the different groups of insects. And then the numbers in parentheses are the number of species that we included. So bees are the top group that had the most at-risk species, with about 35% of the species we assessed being at risk. Butterflies and moths had closer to 25% of their species at risk. And then flowerflies and beetles had fewer of the species that we assessed being at risk. And you'll see that there's a large portion of flower flies that we actually were unable to rank. And so we just need more information about them. And where do these species occur? So again, our range and occurrence data allowed us to analyze where the pollinators were most at risk. And what these are showing you, the map on the right in the blue is showing you the total species richness of pollinators. So all the species that we included, no matter what their rank was, where they occur. And you can see the in the West, particularly in California, right, we've got a really high biodiversity of pollinators out here. And that sort of is mirrored also by the number of species that are at risk. And you can see the darker red in the left-hand map is where there are more species at risk. So at California, not only do we have a high number of pollinators, we also have a high number of at-risk pollinators. And these matched the maps for the bees. And the bees, again, were our highest group that had the most at-risk species, and the most of those at-risk species occur in the Southwest. And this makes sense. There's a really high species richness of bees in the Southwest, and this is mostly due to the fact that there are many there's species with narrow ranges that are specialist species. So a lot of them are specialists on only certain types of plants. So whether it's most of the time it's not just one species, but one genus or one family of plants. And so we have a lot of those specialist bees out here in the West and the Southwest. The other unique thing about the West is that it's very floristically, as you all know, and topographically rich. And with all the deserts, there's a lot of bare ground. And that's a really important nesting feature for bees, as over 70% of the bees that we have in this country are ground nesting bees. And so having all that bare ground in those deserty, dry areas is really, really important for those bees. And then if you're interested, I looked a little bit more in detail at the bee groups that are most at risk. And in fact, we found that the leafcutter bees were the group that were most vulnerable, followed closely by the digger bees, as over 40% of them were at risk that we looked at. You can also see the leafcutter bees have a large chunk of red, and that is that historical category. So a little over a dozen of the leafcutter bees, in fact, were GH. So we haven't seen them in many years, is basically what that means. And so our data are also able to tell us where people should look. Okay, what species should we look for? We haven't seen, this dozen leafcutter bees in 30, 40 years. We can tell the network, you should really go out and look for this bee or that bee. And in fact, this did happen. One leafcutter bee in Oklahoma, Megachile parksii, was rediscovered recently by one of our network biologists, and it went from a GH or historical to a G2. So it's still imperiled because it's a specialist of sand dunes in Kansas and Oklahoma, if you can imagine. So those sand dunes are not a very common habitat there. So yeah, it just goes to show that, there's updates that can constantly be made for these species, and it's important to focus on the ones that we don't know a lot about. Just to kind of show you a little bit about butterflies too, we also found that the greatest species richness of butterflies was in the West, but also in kind of more of a Rocky Mountain areas. And butterflies, and in the North a little bit more too. And butterflies are unique in that there's a lot that overwinter as either eggs or larvae, like first in-stage caterpillars, the smallest caterpillar, and they're under the winter on mountaintops under the snow. And so you can imagine that they've been pretty hit hard by climate change with an early snow melt or no snow at all. And so we do find that a lot of those at-risk butterflies are also kind of in the intermountain west and not just the kind of far Southwest. All right, so what's threatening these species? And I'm going to go into these threats a little bit more later, but the main threats that we found in our study were climate change came out as the #1 threat, and this is one of the first assessments that NatureServe has done where climate change has come out as the #1 threat. And that's mostly because these assessments were done fairly recently. And so we have a lot more and better data for these species. Agriculture came out as a top threat, as well as sort of habitat loss from development, which for pollinators results in fewer host plants. Agriculture and urban areas come along with pesticides, as well as fewer nesting sites and just kind of habitat homogeneity. And we also were interested in where these top threats occurred. And we found that in the West, in fact, and in the North, you can see that climate change was indeed the #1 threat. In the center of both countries, agriculture came out as the #1 threat, not surprising. And then the East is a little bit of a mix more of urban development and pollution. So you may have been noticing that California is a pretty important area when it comes to pollinator biodiversity, but it's actually not just for pollinators. This is a map product that NatureServe produces called the Map of Biodiversity Importance. And this is looking at all the species that we have ranked. So animals, plants, you name it. So they're all in here. So you can still see that even so, California is a really important area for biodiversity. You might notice too that the Southeast has a lot of biodiversity. Oh, I should mention that the darker the red, the more concentrations of imperiled biodiversity. And in the Southeast, that's the concentration of more freshwater organisms. So freshwater mussels and fish are down in that area. So it's a really important area for that biodiversity. But California is extremely important for insects, pollinators, at-risk pollinators, and the like. So I wanted to kind of look a little bit closer at some examples, particularly in the area of your chapter. So kind of San Francisco and northern San Mateo County. And to do this, I turned to iNaturalist, which is a great community science platform. I know I've looked back at some of the talks we've had. I know some other folks have talked about it, so you may be familiar with it. But basically, I like to use it as a tool to kind of see what's there, what's in an area. And so I put a boundary around the peninsula here and looked and saw, okay, what insects are in this area and what insects that are research grade. And so if you're familiar with iNaturalist terminology, you might know that research grade is like when more than one person has identified it, and so it's more likely to be accurate. So in fact, there are over 40,000 observations, this is of just insects, in this area on iNaturalist. Over 1,000 species have been identified, and about over 6,000 people have contributed. So that's pretty cool. There's a lot of folks out there finding some neat insects. So I was really impressed. And if you want to look at the top 10 insects that have been found in this area, here they are. There's a handful of non-native species that's in the little pink box that says IN, including the western honeybee, which is the most common insect observed. But there are lots of butterflies. There are 5 butterflies here and a black-tailed bumblebee that's been observed many times. And if you look at the next top 10, so 11 through 20, you get 7 butterflies, mostly native species here, and then including my favorite bumblebee, the yellow-faced bumblebee as well. So it was pretty cool to see. And then I wanted to look a little bit more at like the different categories of insects. So first I looked at beetles, and I was actually really surprised to see that the top 10 beetles that are found are mostly ladybugs. People really like taking photos of ladybugs. But ladybugs aside, there are over 200 species of beetles that have been captured just in this small area by over 1,000, almost 2,000 people. So got lots of beetles. So some of you may know, you're mostly probably a lot of you are gardeners, so you probably all know that ladybugs are predators. So they're really important predators that people like in their gardens. I also kind of chuckled when I saw the devil's coach horse beetle, because when I was a student at San Francisco State, I took an entomology course, and I remember finding that in Golden Gate Park and being fascinated by it. It is unfortunately a non-native species, but it's a predator, and it's pretty harmless. It's a pretty cool bug. One beetle that I did find in the observation that I wanted to talk a little bit more about was a pollinator. and that's this one here. It's called the ornate checkered beetle. And this species is actually doing pretty well. It's ranked as a G5. So there's probably more of them in the San Francisco area. We just haven't been found yet, but it's mostly a Western species, as you can see. However, there hasn't really been much of an indication of decline, which is great. It still remains pretty abundant. And this beetle is pretty cool because it has a unique life cycle where it lays eggs on flowers, and so it pollinates them. But when those eggs hatch, they sort of hitch a ride on bees that are also pollinating the plants, and then they consume the pollen and nectar ball that the bee has brought for its own young. And so they're a little bit of a parasite in that way on bees. But all of them pollinate, so the job gets done for the flower. That's nature, right? So the beetle here is doing okay because it's a habitat generalist. It can occur in a variety of habitats, including meadows and forests and shrubs and deserts. So it's pretty well, it's a secure species. I looked a little bit at the bees. I didn't really go too much into them because I know there's been other talks about bees recently for your chapter, but it is pretty cool to see that there are 51 species of bees that have been captured. And over 6,000 observations. Of course, I wanted to look at the flower flies or the syrphids or the hoverflies. I was really interested in seeing what kind of syrphids there are. And in fact, there are 45 species of syrphids that have been captured. So almost the same number as syrphids as bees. And here's one, the Western aphid eater, that I kind of just wanted to point out. Like many syrphids, this flower fly pollinates as an adult, but as a larvae or a caterpillar, it eats aphids. It's a predator, so that's why it's called the aphid eater. So syrphids are really neat in that they have a lot of them have that stage where the adults pollinate and sip nectar from flowers, whereas the larvae are predators and they eat other insects. And so they're kind of like a farmer's dream, if you will. And this one is also doing pretty good. It's found throughout the Western United States and into Mexico as well. And then I looked a little bit at the butterflies. We've got 256 species that have been documented in the peninsula here. And really many neat species that hopefully a lot of you have seen before. And one of them that has been cited is the coastal green hair streak, which is a rare species. It's ranked as imperiled, G2. And it is found just in coastal California areas. And it the host plant is the coastal buckwheat. Also, I think it uses deerweed and sea pink as well. So the larvae can develop on that. It's imperiled mostly because it has a general small range, and you can see there's quite a bit of occurrences, but unfortunately it's threatened a bit by development as well as invasive plants taking over its host plant. Another species of butterfly that's been seen is the Lindsay skipper. This is a vulnerable species, so G3. This one is found more in grassy areas because, in fact, its host plants are grasses. So California oatgrass is one of its host plants. Idaho fescue is another. And unfortunately, as a lot of grassland specialists, it's threatened by non-native grasses as well as conversion of its habitat to development and agricultural reasons. Okay, so now that we've looked at some of the local species in the area, I wanted to kind of dive a little bit more into the threats. And so first, kind of taking a look at development. This maps are some projections for parts of Central and Northern California. I have like, so the United States on the left-hand side, and then the out picture of the Central California area. And this is a unique kind of new look at development vulnerability index for till 2050. And this was done by a university and Esri, which is kind of ArcGIS place. and it predicts the vulnerability to land cover change from natural vegetation. And the colors are on the scale of 0 to 1, with 1 being that yellow color, and it's the most vulnerable to land use change, whereas the dark purple is more a 0, and it's the least vulnerable. So you can see there's, even though San Francisco and the peninsula are urbanized, if you will, there's still a lot of natural vegetation that has the potential to be converted to development and other uses. And so it is something of a concern that habitat loss is still a threat to our insect species in this area. Another major threat is climate change. This is looking at the days per year with a heat index over 100 degrees, from the historical to what we expect in 2050. And San Francisco itself is pretty okay. You can see it doesn't really change the yellow color from one to the other. But the rest of California, is heating up. So we're concerned about all this fantastic insect biodiversity that we have of temperature increases impacting them. Similar with precipitation, the projected change in precipitation at the end of the century. In the winter, it's kind of a neutral situation, but spring, summer, and fall, it gets more of that brown color, which is less precipitation. So there's more drought predicted into the future, which is also really detrimental for not only humans, but also all biodiversity, including pollinators. Particularly the spring loss of precipitation is important, as a lot of our native bees come out pretty early in the year, in March-ish, and they need some flowers and some floral resources. Climate change impacts animals and insects in many ways. Long term, there's changes in warming, changes in seasonality, which can cause species to no longer tolerate their range, their thermal kind of area where they are, and so they might need to move. It changes the timing potentially of their host plants, or the flowering of those host plants. It changes interactions, potentially increasing invasive species, potentially like for instance, honeybees do better in warmer temperatures than bumblebees do. And then extreme events, unfortunately, we're all pretty familiar with fire in California, can be really detrimental. Drought, which doesn't seem to be like an extreme, it should be classified as an extreme event anymore, unfortunately. But those things directly cause mortality of individuals as well as their habitats and host plants. So there's been some studies that have really looked at the impact of climate change on species. This comes out of a great lab in Nevada who's been studying climate change impacts on Western butterflies. This graph is a little complicated, but basically, if you look at the vertical dotted line on the left-hand side, it's looking at greater summer warming, and on the right-hand side, greater fall warming. And then above or below the horizontal line is increasing or decreasing butterfly populations. And as you can see, most of the decline is happening with the greater fall warming. And so this is a little bit concerning. Our butterflies are pretty adapted to hot summers, but with the fall increasing and warming, that can really change maybe some of the timing of the drying out of their host plants, or the timing of when they go into kind of diapause or hibernation, and it's impacting species. So another figure from that same paper, which is kind of hard to see, basically looks at the butterflies and how they're declining with climate change. And all of these species listed here are in fact declining with the increased temperatures. And some of these species are really common, like the Western painted lady. So I talked a little bit about development and climate change, but in fact, the threats to insects are synergistic. I know this figure is very busy, and don't try to read it, but basically I like it a lot because, people ask sort of what's going on with insects, and it's really not any one story. And so as Dave Wagner and co call this death by a thousand cuts, and it really is kind of how to describe it. We've got climate change, we've got habitat loss, pesticides, invasive species, all of these things kind of happening at once. are impacting insect populations and why we're seeing them declining 2% per year. The last example I give you of threats here is kind of looking at that. It's actually like a study like looking at a butterfly, the Melissa blue. And the Melissa blue is an example of a butterfly that went from recently, it was ranked secure or G5, and it went to that G4, apparently secure. And if you remember, I kind of mentioned that those are ones that have something going on with them. They're still doing okay, but there's something pushing them down from that higher level. And what this study looked at was basically the synergy of 3 kinds of threats to this butterfly: climate change, pesticides, and host plant changes. The normal host plant of this butterfly is astragalus, but it will also use alfalfa, but alfalfa is less desirable. And so they looked at the survival of that species, which is the dotted red line in the graph. And you can see that all of the treatments that were alfalfa, or the dotted brown line, are below that survival level. So it didn't do well on alfalfa, basically. The other components of this graph is from left to right is pesticides from lower to higher concentration. And you can see a general decline to the right where pesticides are high. So those are, not only is the alfalfa impacting it, but also the high pesticides. And then they also looked at a climate warming scenario. So the different colored shapes are different warming scenarios, and you'll see that the brown squares and circles are lower than all the other lines, and that's the highest warming scenario. So basically, if this butterfly is forced to use a non-ideal host plant in an area with pesticides in a hotter area, it's really not going to do well. Its survival is impacted. Okay, so now we've talked about sort of what's going on, what are the threats and how they're impacting insects, and then some examples of local ones. So kind of stepping back and thinking about the bigger picture and what we're doing, what this information can do, and kind of what you can do as well. So in 2020, I was part of a group that put together an insect conservation roadmap paper. And this is a figure from that paper. And basically, we kind of came up with several actions. Those are 4 categories, but the first 2 I'm going to show you here. So the first one is this like immediate actions that we can take. These are things that, you know, you can even take as an individual, and I'll call some out in a minute. But other things that I do in my job and at NatureServe is to work for the education and awareness. And that's things like, you know, this talk here. And now that you know so much about all of this, you can also educate folks as well. Also really focus on conservation of threatened species. So we work a lot with rare and endangered species. And then the second kind of key component of this was some kind of prioritization scheme. So this was the idea that we should be performing these large-scale assessments to figure out how we should prioritize this problem, because it's a big problem, right? But we can't just sort of jump at it at once, but we got to figure out how we prioritize it. So by having these conservation status assessments, we're able to answer some of those prioritization questions, like what species, where, and why. Another important thing that these data kind of help with is they show where to concentrate efforts, where we need more surveys. And I kind of talked about this already with those species that we think may be historical or really rare. In fact, we should concentrate our efforts to see if they're still there, if there are more of them, and if they really are gone or declining, why is that? Another important point is to point out hotspots or trends, so areas of high biodiversity and high threat. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service uses NatureServe conservation status ranks to, for bees particular, for folks to come and look at maybe areas of where they want to do a project or where they are looking at doing surveys. They can figure out where are the hotspots of imperiled bees and their threats and whatnot. And then finally, something that is really important and something that we work very closely with is to use these conservation status assessments to get species included in what's called the species wildlife action plans, or the state wildlife action plans, sorry, the SWAPs. These are basically the assessments, and this is kind of a busy figure, but it's from a recent NatureServe publication. So the assessments not only tell us about how biodiversity is doing, but they feed directly into state and federal conservation designations. So the state wildlife action plans are shown here in yellow. They're important tools, and they're often underutilized for insects in particular. A lot of times you'll see more vertebrate animals in there, but they're getting better with including insects and pollinators in particular. And those assessments, they feed directly into those action plans. And then those action plans determine kind of what species are of the greatest conservation need, which ones are vulnerable, which ones are imperiled. And then that really that's where funding from the state agencies are directed. So it determines which species are monitored for, it determines which ones get habitat management or habitat restoration money. And so they're really important to figure out for on the ground conservation efforts. And then I also wanted to note how the top of this purple box on the top here that says inventory, we can't really do these assessments without having a knowledge base. And part of that knowledge base includes things like iNaturalist or other community science things that you can be a part of. And I just love this figure because it just shows like how much of the data that we have now is coming from iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is now 85% of all non-bird, non-European GBIF records since 2020, which is just mind-boggling. So if you just look at North America alone, the top left-hand pie chart is a moth, and all of that yellow component of the pie is from the data come from iNaturalist. So the data that are coming from this platform really are becoming sort of the data that we have for a lot of these groups of species. So if you are using iNaturalist, thank you so much for contributing. If you're not, I encourage you to do so. Other things that you can do, you know, a lot of you probably already know a lot of this or either doing this because you're likely plant enthusiasts and plants really go hand in hand with insects. So just to kind of reiterate some of the things you might know though, to increase the variety in your garden, particularly year round. And I was poking around on the Yerba Buena website and I found some really great resources and already some resources that talk about how you need to plant plants year round that are flowering, and it tells you which ones, and it's just amazing. I mean, we live in an area where we can do that. Not many people can say that. So having plants that are flowering year round really is a way to feed your insects. Replace them with exotics whenever you're able to. Sometimes, you know, flowers are better than no flowers, but native flowers are better than non-native flowers. So I kind of think of it that way. Eliminate pesticide use. Hopefully this is kind of goes without saying, but an important component to think about, and you probably have lots of great resources in San Francisco for this, but not everybody does, are to find seeds and plant starts that are not treated with pesticides. Another really important one is to leave the leaves. Although a lot of people don't like this because it creates kind of a messy environment, but in fact, here's a picture I like to show of a moth cocoon on the bottom of a leaf. Those are the places where insects survive the winter, in brown stems, under brown leaves, under, you know, areas that don't look very nice to us, and down logs. So if you can kind of leave those things as much as possible, it will go a long way. Making sure the lights are turned off at night is really important for all life, but insect life too, particularly moths. Support conservation policies and programs, educate others, and participate in community science. And the one last slide I'll leave you with, a lot of folks ask me about, what about climate change? It's such a big problem, and I feel kind of hopeless to do anything about it. Of course, you know, policy supporting is something you can do in your own personal energy footprint. However, for insects, recent work has shown that in fact, providing refugia or these kind of habitat pockets really can actually mitigate some of the issues of climate change, providing water, providing heterogeneous habitat. There's a list here on the right of insect supportive environmental features. that, if the insects are kind of whammed with habitat loss and climate change, one of the things that you can help is to reverse that habitat loss component. And so they might be able to survive the other threats a little bit better. And yeah, and with that, I just will throw up a bunch of names of folks who have been involved in a lot of this work that I showed you and some funding that we've received. And then I will take questions.
Wow, thank you so much. That was really incredible. I learned a lot.
Yeah, it's sort of devastating news. Of course, we knew about it, but it comforts us to know that that science is tracking it so well and gives a lot of hope.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot we can do. That's the kind of nice thing about insects is that they're small and they don't need big areas. And so there's things we can do for sure.
All right.
Gosh, sorry, I keep flipping that.
Well, we do have quite a few questions, and some and a lot of the resources that you provided, people referred to links to them in the chat. So if people want to get more detail later, they can refer back to the YouTube channel and to the chat right now. But we do have some questions. Let's see.
And also some thanks.
Yes,
Katie says
many
that
thanks.
was awesome.
Oh, thank
And
you.
it was. That is definitely a major tour, and we learned a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot to include, and once you start putting it together, you don't want to take anything out.
Yeah, no, we greatly appreciate it too. It was really beautifully done. Um, One of the easy ones, Linda said, can you put the slide back up with your funders, please?
Oh, sure.
And I don't know if you want to look through these or not, or we're happy to deliver some of these questions.
Oh, yeah, I can see them, huh?
Yeah, I know Susan Mullaney, who is the vice president of our chapter, and a
All right, I can go back.
really good naturalist, is asking, is anyone tracking microarthropods in the soil as well, or is this pretty much above ground work?
Yeah, that is a great question. Unfortunately, not really. People are interested in it, and people know that it's extremely important thing to do, and that they're probably being impacted a lot more, like disproportionately almost as well, pesticides and fertilizers and whatnot. Yeah, I was an author on a paper that we did a review of the impacts of pesticides on soil invertebrates. And yeah, you can imagine that it was pretty hard hit, but there were certain groups that are more impacted than others. So I think it's like an area that's sort of rife that needs to be, yeah, expanded more. It's a good question.
Right. Here's sort of a bit of a long one, but I'll try and encapsulate it. Any studies being done on the impact of infrastructure such as data centers, cell towers, solar farms, um, as well as space junk on the climate change? I'm not sure about the space junk, but as well as the mammals during this presentation. Any organization tracking the connection between what's happening with climate change and the increasing use of the aforementioned? I think that you had alluded to some of that as far as in the climate connection.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
I think they want to know if the infrastructure, such as, especially really high power consuming ones, I believe is what they're talking about, data centers, cell towers.
Oh,
And then
especially with
the
AI.
solar farms and solar on rooftops and
Yeah.
things that are actually just basically taking out. Now solar farms, that would be an interesting thing to study because
Oh, yeah.
we're of course we a lot of us love the desert, and it's always shocking to go out there and see these giant solar fields. And usually
Yeah,
they denude the vegetation
Correct.
right.
first, and so we're like, oh my gosh, that's just a tremendous loss right there. But
Yeah.
anyway, I guess that's probably not a really easy thing to study, or maybe it's
Yeah.
totally easy if if they're completely denuding it.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. There are folks that are really interested in solar farms and pollinator habitat, because there's a bit of kind of greenwashing sometimes, right? Folks will say like we can create pollinator habitat with solar farms, but I think, and I do think there are ways to do it, just like agriculture, lots of ways to do things more sustainably, right? And it's important obviously to switch to renewable energy, but it's very circumstantial, like your desert example is a good one. That might not be the best place. Like I haven't looked into it, but there's places, where you can put solar energy that are already developed or already degraded that are no longer habitat for pollinators.
Right, parking lots.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that that's a good conversation to have, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure about
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
And then Bob Hall, our conservation chair, is asking, says, I used to hear a lot about neonicotinoids, but not as much lately. Are those chemicals still wreaking havoc and causing insect decline?
Yeah, as far as I know, I did a lot of work on those about 5 years ago, and yeah, they are pretty harsh pesticides that they last long, and they can get into natural vegetation and other water bodies and areas, and can really wreak havoc on insect populations. They're pretty toxic. So as far as I know, yes, that's still happening. Around 2015, I think, or 2014, the federal government stopped publishing where they're used nationally. And so you'll see a lot of the studies that are done on those will use data from 2014, which is the last year that we have kind of good data on where those are being used. That might be one of the reasons. I'm pretty sure California is still doing that, publishing information, but outside of it, it's harder to kind of know what's being used and where. So that could potentially be part of the reason.
And then we have a question about wildfires in California and the impacts. And since there are so many more zones being designated high fire hazard areas, and encouraging residents to do this hardening, removing vegetation. I mean, in some ways, if there is bare ground, that can benefit some insects, I would imagine. But is that also impacting species, since people are encouraged to remove that vegetation?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's been a lot of talk. I'm in Sonoma County, so you can imagine that's a big question here. And there's been a lot of talk about doing it well, and doing it with a mind for conservation, with a mind for biodiversity. And I'm really excited that people are having that conversation and it's coming up, because I do think it's really important. You can't just go out there and like cut everything, like willy-nilly, especially in some natural areas, which I think, can happen sometimes. It's hard to talk about people's private property, but when it comes to like the biology of the insects, yes, definitely bare ground is helpful for nesting, but it's not really helpful if it's not sort of near other resources like flowers, and things that they need to provision their young to get that floral resources. So I think it's again, it's kind of like this balance of management. It's like, obviously we need to do that to protect human life and their structures, but at the same time, thinking about it strategically, where we can incorporate some of these features that allow pollinators and other insects to persist.
Katie asked, you know, in regards to conservation education, is there research or any tips on what type of messaging is the most successful and impactful?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of research out about that. And I'm not super familiar with it all. I did write actually a while back when I was a professor, I wrote a paper about this. I got to think back, but you know, I think there's been kind of hands-on is always really helpful for people to see insects, to see them in their native environment, to do kind of maybe some of these like iNaturalist, go out there and take some pictures or just look at them on flowers. I think that's important to get people connected physically with some of these areas. To talk about some like really cool natural history. I think insects are so easy for that because they are, each one of them has just like fascinating natural like life history. Is important, and less so maybe kind of like the doom and gloom kind of message. But I think that obviously that's important to incorporate as reality, but just getting people to kind of connect in a way that makes them like delight when they hear about these creatures, because unfortunately I do think there's a lot of folks that don't have that reaction still. Yeah, it's a good question.
One of the people that posted, Susan McCarthy, mentioned backyards serving as tiny refugia. You know, ideas like that are
Yep,
good
absolutely.
to kind of communicate.
She was actually asking that as a question, and we can give you a first-hand experience that absolutely. we- in fact, we estimate in our tiny little San Francisco backyard, we have more pollinator insects than in the rest of the neighborhood altogether, just
I
because
bet it's true.
some of the plants, I mean, there would just be hundreds and hundreds of bees and dozens of butterflies buzzing around on them at times. So
How lovely. Yeah, and I bet that's true. Isn't that amazing that, you know, they'll come if you have it?
Right.
yeah,
Field of Dreams
yeah.
message. That's really nice. Yeah, to hear that. It really does work.
Yeah, and it's really helped because across the street, we've nativized a slope over across the street, and there's a connection there. You know, it's just like you get a critical mass. I
Yep.
think is
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah. Yeah, like a lot of you know, these species, especially the pollinators, they sometimes are dependent on only certain kinds of plants that they've evolved with. So
Yeah. Anyway, I'm confident, highly confident that the backyards do serve as
yep,
refugia,
they really
and
do.
if you get your neighborhood involved,
Yeah,
it even becomes more important, more
absolutely.
impactful. So Jessica asked, have you investigated successful conservation of different types of insect-eating species,
Oh.
and how it would make sense if there was a decrease in the insect these animals eat? Also, many types of insects that are poisonous or taste bad. Maybe those insects populations have not been as affected.
There's definitely evidence that birds have also declined as a result, especially birds that eat larger insects. Um, so there's definitely a kind of food chain cascading impact here of loss of insects. I don't think predation itself is usually not like considered, especially if it's from another native species, a threat. Um, Obviously, potentially could be if you're dealing with just if this population of the insect that you're interested in has declined a lot due to other reasons like habitat loss and other things, and there's only a small one, and its predator finds it. There's potential for that, but I mean, then you know it's likely to kind of go extinct as a result of just sort of genetic small population forces. So usually predation is not per se kind of a big concern in terms of threats for conservation. But it does go the other way, like predators are declining as a result of the loss of their prey.
Take this next one.
So Clint asks about fire agencies that are clearing the understory for fuel reduction. Can you speak to how that could have an impact on the soil dwelling invertebrates?
Yeah, absolutely. It could have an impact on them. Probably through micro habitat changes. So if the understory is gone, it will change a little bit the the sort of moisture level in the soil. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a specific example. And like right now, I just am picturing walls of broom that have been taken out here in Sonoma County. And in general, like the broom, as a very invasive species, it's kind of it's almost like semi-restoration to get rid of it like that. And I haven't done a study in terms of how it's impacting or what species use those areas and how it's impacting it. But if you've got some like more native understory vegetation, then yeah, it could really impact the microclimate. But if they kind of do it in a way that mimics a fire, which is a natural phenomenon, then probably in the long term, it won't negatively impact the populations.
There's more. You've really raised a lot of curiosity here. There are a lot of questions, so we don't want to keep you too long. But if you have the energy for a few more.
Sure, I could take a little bit more, and then people could, if you have any like burning questions, I put my email up. Feel free to shoot me an email.
Oh, great.
Very generous.
Someone also they asked if maybe they could look at the slide before the last one again. Oh,
Yeah.
maybe that's not it. The one with your with the funders.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that one, right? Your collaborators.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They want to collaborate too.
Oh, okay.
And Jeffrey asks, it seems that prohibiting the sale of invasive non-native species would be relatively easy. Why isn't this being done? What are the obstacles?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Jeffrey, we give you a list of people to ask it to.
Yes, please. I'm with you.
Right.
Yeah, not everybody feels the same way, I guess.
No.
But yeah, I think it's just, I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a good one.
Yeah, several different theories. And
Sure, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well, there's been some headway.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Just
It's hard
being
to
able
break.
to list which ones are invasive.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Because I guess there's a lot of non-natives that people will use in their gardens that aren't gonna escape, right? So
Yeah. The horticulture industry, though, has demonstrated a kind of an arrogance, for sure.
oh yeah.
So, and they're making a lot of money with their current formulas. So,
They're easier to grow, some of them, I'm sure, yeah.
yeah, sorry about that, if
No
anybody's
problem.
in that industry.
No problem.
But
Yeah, if
yeah,
anybody wants to email me, here I'll slip that again. Feel free. Otherwise, yeah.
well, how about this one more question?
Oh,
I
okay.
think this is kind of a good one.
Okay.
But in regards to agricultural crops, Lyndon says, what if any benefits do agricultural crops derive from native pollinators that have specialized on native plants here in California? So not honeybees, I suppose.
Right.
It's never been clear if there's a benefit to some of them. And, is there basically maybe are there better ways to work with the agricultural industry, which is so dominant on our landscape here?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think Yes, definitely they're beneficial. Like a lot of the insects are, or the pollinators are generalists. Particularly like as adults, they'll go to anything. Whereas like you think of like a butterfly, like a caterpillar might be able to only be raised on a certain host plant, but the adults they'll get nectar from all flowers. So pretty much with the pollinators, like most of them will go to a lot of those things and help with pollinating. There are some, of course, that are specialized on different genera or different families, but families of plants are really big. There's like a lot of plants that would be under that family. And so it's I'm not a botanist or a horticulturist by any means, so I'm not sure which plants would fall under particularly that, or some that are important for agricultural crops. But I'm sure there's some overlap there. But there's a lot of native bees that will still go to agricultural crops, and some that can be used semi-commercially, like the mason bees, that could be used as well instead of honeybees.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there were more native insects going to native agricultural crops, like, the squashes, the corn,
Yeah,
as
that's a good
opposed to the
point.
ones that have been introduced from other continents.
There you go. You just answered that. Squash. Squash bees.
Okay, we need a graduate student here.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I'm sure it's been done, and probably at UC Santa Cruz where I went. There's a lot of great agricultural pollination research going on there, but again, I was studying the tiger beetles at the time, so.
Yeah. Well, Tara, thank you so much for being with us tonight, and that was really a fascinating and inspiring, despite the sobering consequences we're seeing from, the way we do things. But
Action we can all take.
there's actions, right? And
Yeah.
you're getting much gratitude from folks. So,
Oh, thank you. And
yeah,
thank you all for, I mean, just hearing what you're talking about with your own garden, and I'm sure a lot of you are champions for that. It sounds like from the conversation. You really are like saving a lot of these species in San Francisco by providing these, gardens and these native plants. So it's a big
it's a
deal.
joy
Yeah.
to watch them.
Right.
So, yeah. Thanks, and
Thank
we
you.
will hopefully we'll catch you up in the field sometime in the near future.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Good night.